This video is a long time coming, and I'm fired up to be sitting here talking about USC football in a long form format on my own social platforms. For the first time in a minute, I've gone on other podcasts. I used to host co-host the Lincoln Riley Monday Night Coaches Show. As you guys know, if you're watching this video, I produce a lot of short form content on a daily basis. And I think as a former player, when you have relationships with the school, it's hard to dive in on a short form platform because you know how nuanced and how many layers there are to the subject matter. So I think subconsciously that's why I just haven't produced that much USC short form content. And oh, by the way, we haven't been very good the past couple years, which then makes it even harder to make content. But I'm sitting here, it's the end of the week, it's a Friday afternoon, about to dive into a little tequila the second I get done filming this. And I was like, you know what? Let me put some notes down. I got some stats here as well and just go and riff. I'll call it the State of the Union for USC football, how I see it. If you are stumbling across this video or someone sent you this video and you're a USC fan and you're like, yo, you're the dude that started like 3 games for us and got benched for Sam Darnold, like where have you been? I've been creating content, full-time content creator and broadcaster, produce a lot of short form content on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram. So hit that subscribe button down below and drop a comment if you're a USC football fan, because I'd love to make more USC content. I've started making long form videos this month that'll be podcasts as well, which then gives me a good little platform to dive into my alma mater a lot more than I have in the past. So dude, when I used to host the post-game radio shows and used to take all your calls, you know, I heard some characters on there and a lot of complaints and just hot takes out of left field. That's not what this is going to be. This is going to be thorough. This is going to be thoughtful. This is going to be fair and critical when appropriate. But I got 6 or 7 what I view as facts about the USC football program. A lot of you are not going to agree that these are facts. I'm going to defend myself. If you disagree with me, let me know in the comments. And I'm just going to riff and let you know where I net out with each of these. The first fact, USC is a blue blood program that is underperforming. Second, Lincoln Riley is a good football coach who's also underperforming. Third, I think there was a disconnect between the job Lincoln Riley thought he was going to have at USC and the realities of what being the head coach at USC are really like. And I'll dive into each of these in more depth, but I want to give you the rundown to start. I think Lincoln Riley and the program as a whole underestimated the negative impacts of going so hard in the transfer portal those first 2 seasons. I think if you're a USC football fan, it's a fact that if you're comparing even subconsciously everything to the Pete Carroll days, that is out of touch. Pete Carroll hasn't been the head coach at USC in 15 years. When Pete Carroll took the head job at USC, smartphones weren't even a thing. Now smartphones are driving recruiting, driving our society. They play a huge factor in recruiting, and I won't go down a whole digital social media lesson, but you guys get the point. I think the reality is it's a fact that the perception around USC would be a lot different if the close games had fallen a different way for USC this past year. And if you're hearing that and being like, Max, you're soft, that's the whole point. That's why we're frustrated, because we're USC and we should win those close games. I think that's fair, but when you look at the stats of this thing, USC is so far and away an outlier with a lot of those close game metrics. Like it's almost not a fluke, but it's crazy. And so I'll get into that. The first one, USC is a blue blood program that's underperforming. That's just a fact. And a lot of the points I'll get to will support that. We obviously know that. My big takeaway there is 5 years ago, it would have been no questions asked. USC is a top 5 job in America. No questions asked. Nowadays, I don't think that's a common take. I could make the argument it's still, number 4, number 5, but with the realities of where NIL is at right now, I don't think that is a sentiment of a coach in the market right now. I don't think they view USC as a top 5 job, which is crazy because you would have got laughed at. I would have got reamed in the comments if I said that 5 years ago. I also think it's interesting, and this is where I think the USC fan has shifted their mentality from the Lincoln Riley era compared to the Clay Helton era, in that this is not just a Lincoln Riley issue. I think USC fans, the average USC fan, they might not say it, but I've sensed a difference within the fan base of, they know that's not just a Lincoln Riley issue. Versus with Clay Helton, it was fire Clay Helton, man. We got to get back to the Pete Carroll days. We just don't have that head coach, man. He's not the answer. Versus now, now, the average USC fan sitting there saying, wait a sec, Lincoln Riley won a lot of games at Oklahoma. Wait a sec, the two head coaches that we fired, Lane Kiffin, Steve Sarkisian. Steve Sarkisian's knocking on the door of a national championship and coaching another blue blood. And Lane Kiffin is one of the most popular coaches in college football right now, leading cutting edge with NIL, bringing Ole Miss up to maybe not tier 1 of the SEC, but right there with tier 2 in a lot of schools that historically have much greater prestige than Ole Miss does. Point being that USC has fired head coaches that continue to be nationally relevant in our sport, having success. I think the average USC fan is sitting there saying, you know what, this isn't necessarily just a head coaching deal. On that note though, I do think Lincoln Riley is a really good football coach. I do think he's underperforming. I think he would tell you that. I do think there's areas that he can fix, and I think there's mistakes that he has brought about on his own since he took over the USC job. But I think it's a fact that if Lincoln Riley got fired tomorrow by USC, he could get any play calling job in America that he wanted in college football and maybe the NFL. If a power 2 job in the Big Ten or the SEC came available, I think every AD would give a call to Lincoln Riley. I think if a job opened in the ACC or the Big 12, Lincoln Riley would be a top candidate for any one of those jobs. And so again, this storyline of, oh, we've seen Sark go there, we've seen Kiffin go there, oh, by the way, Clay Helton's still a head coach in Division I football. If that happened with those guys, Lincoln Riley, to me, he's got a great personality. I think he's level-headed. I never feel like he's selling me anything. I think he's authentic. I think he's very true to himself. I think he's an offensive mind. If I was a quarterback and a high school recruit and the former 5-star recruit that I once was, I would want to play for that guy. If I was a kid with a son who wanted to go play for a head coach that is going to be true to me, I think Lincoln Riley is a good man and a great football coach. And this is not a defend Lincoln Riley podcast. It's more of just prefacing it as, if your lens right now is Lincoln Riley is the issue, I think you're missing the point. There are mistakes that he has made during his time at USC. Hanging on to Alex Grinch for that second year was a mistake. His loyalty failed him in that Alex Grinch phase where a lot of people thought that he should have got fired. When you look at the stats, which I was going to get into later, but I pulled it up. Defensively for USC, man, dude, in 2023, USC had the 3rd best offense in the country scoring wise. They had the 121st scoring defense, which I know USC fans, you know that, but that is crazy. If you just had a pedestrian defense, that year could have been totally different, which totally changes the vibe of where USC's at right now. Like imagine if they had Danton Lynn in year 2. So I think that was a mistake. I think his competitive advantage as a play caller has lessened since he took the job at USC. I think the football world has caught up to him in how creative and innovative in the schemes that he's doing. Keep in mind, when he was play calling at Oklahoma and took over that head job, his way of thinking with the air raid pass concepts and leaning heavily on GT counter run scheme, like he was the dude driving the car for that. And the blend of that was phenomenal. And he was putting up tons of points and having tons of success and Heisman Trophy winners and the whole deal. He still is a elite level football mind. Again, why I think he could get any play calling job in college football tomorrow if he wanted. But I think the football world has caught up to him. I think there's, a lot of younger play callers that might not have had their DNA rooted in old school West Coast pro style offenses. I don't think that's as much of a competitive advantage. Also because your ability to call plays is not as important nowadays as your ability to go out on the recruiting trails and have NIL behind you and go get recruits on your team. That's the most important factor. The second point, I think there was a disconnect. I don't know this to be certain, but it's just my perception from the interviews and watching interviews and just talking around, is that there's a disconnect between the job Lincoln Riley thought he was signing up for at USC and the realities of what that USC job is. I think it's easy from the outside looking in to say all the talking points that we all hear. It's USC. They've got the national championships. They've got the Heisman trophies. They're in Southern California, fertile recruiting grounds. At the time it was, leader out west in the Pac-12, West Coast football, great degree, great weather, the whole deal. But when you actually get into it, it's a school that Lincoln Riley has to go and advocate and recruit fans to show up to games. It's a school that's not elite when it comes to NIL. I think it's hard to establish culture at USC compared to other schools that are more remote, which if you follow me on Twitter, I had an exchange there that I know a lot of USC fans saw. But I think that's the reality of playing in a big city. I think it's easier to rally and rein in 18 to 22-year-olds when you're in remote Blacksburg, Virginia, than it is flashy, high-flying Los Angeles. Sure, there's benefits to that. I'm not making excuses for that, but I think that's a reality reality of the USC job that's so unique to really any of the other blue blood programs. You can maybe say Texas and Austin, but I don't know. Austin is not Los Angeles, not even close. I also think there's a disconnect in terms of how difficult it was going to be to recruit. One of the pet peeves for me is the whole, you got to put a fence around California. Let's just ignore the fact of NIL, which makes it even harder to put a fence around California, because I don't care if the program's in Maine. If they're offering me 3x the amount of money, I'll fly my ass across the country and go play football in Maine. So ignoring that part, I think we ignore or underestimate the impact the digital age had on a recruit's willingness to go across the country. Before smartphones, I would imagine, I was a Seattle kid, I wasn't a Southern California kid, but I would imagine before the smartphone, the prospects and streaming and the whole deal, the prospects of going to the deep South to play college football might as well be going to a foreign country. That's not the case now. There's way more exposure, the intimidation as a West Coast guy, like going to the South and the SEC and all those schools. It's not really a thing. You've seen guys go out there and have success. The gritty kind of SEC culture, not as much of a thing because they have the flashy facilities and the whole deal. Teenagers just in general, our society in general has gone more national as the digital world has connected us more. And it's just literally harder to keep kids in the West Coast, in Southern California. You see all those videos on TikTok of how SEC schools are getting taken over by city folks. Like that's a thing of, kids coming from New York South into SEC country and kids coming from the West Coast into SEC country. It's not just a football thing. I think our society has a greater willingness to leave their home state to go to college and play football. And it especially is the case for the big time recruits. I know when I was a 5-star recruit, I wanted to go play for the blue blood programs. I didn't necessarily want to just stay home because I was willing to say, hey, let me go play at USC. Let me go compete with the best. I think there's an attraction to a certain DNA of kid to go to true SEC country and compete in that area. There was one viral tweet that I want to touch on. It was that Matt Leinart tweet that I'm sure, you saw. It was where, hey, Alabama has more players from the state of California than USC does. I think that speaks to the point that I just made. But I think we need to be careful as well, because I remember the days of, I got recruited by Lane Kiffin. I was a national prospect. I remember at the end of Lane Kiffin's tenure, he got criticism for not recruiting Southern California enough. Just like you see in every sport, whatever the previous head coach did wrong, the next head coach goes a full 180. And Sark's a great recruiter. He recruited a lot more of Southern California. But then that bled into Clay Helton, and Clay Helton, I think, embraced that mentality. I don't follow recruiting like a lot of you probably watching this video. It's my least favorite part about this business. That's a separate video, but I know the general pulse of things. But I remember when Clay Helton got flack for not recruiting at a high enough level. Well, it's kind of hard to find elite level USC blue blood level front seven talent if you're just going to be in Southern California. And so I can remember the days of, well, Lane Kiffin getting criticized for being too national, Helton staying local, also getting criticized a bunch, and Lincoln Riley, a guy that buttered his bread recruiting Southern California at Oklahoma, got to USC, and then now is getting criticized at times. And I know USC's had a good run recruiting lately, but getting criticized at times for going too national. I think he's doing that because he looks around the state and he's not able to get those guys. Yes, he could recruit better. Yes, that program could recruit better. Yes, NIL is a factor. Yes, there's great talent in the state of California. But because of all those factors we just talked about, I think it's not painting the whole picture if you just see that Alabama tweet and say, Alabama's got more players from the state of California. What the heck is USC doing? It's more nuanced than that. But back to that disconnect thing. I think it was just the realities of the USC job. To me, it's highlighted by, I sensed frustration early on from Lincoln Riley of him having to go out and advocate for fans to show up to games. He's not having to do that at Oklahoma. You're not having to do that at other blue blood programs, but it's the reality of, having a college football team in Los Angeles, the fence around California, and then also NIL. My sense is that, and again, I don't know this for sure, but that Lincoln Riley came to USC thinking it's USC. It's University of Spoiled Children. They're going to have all this money. Well, the reality is that's not the case in NIL. USC has enough to be solid in NIL. And if you look at the metrics and whatnot, I don't know this to be true, so take this with a grain of salt. But USC's at that $12, $13 million mark. I know last year the talking point was, hey, we got to get to 15 million to be competitive on the national stage. But then you also look at Ohio State, Texas A&M, Oregon, they're at 20 million. And so the point is USC is not a top 15 school when it comes to NIL. And the same thing is happening with Alabama and Kalen DeBoer. If you follow college football nationally, the two schools that had the most prestigious dynasties in recent memory are two schools that view themselves as blue blood programs. They are blue blood programs, yet they are, I don't want to say struggling, but they are not having an easy time NIL wise. And I think it's because their fan base, I don't want to use the word spoiled because obviously that has a negative connotation. And I don't think that's it. I just don't think there is that desperation hunger to invest in a program to win championships, because deep down it's like, well, yeah, we can do it the old school way, man. We just got to do what Pete Carroll did, man. There's kind of a resistance to the realities of where college football is at versus the flip side. If you're Texas A&M, if you're Oregon, Ole Miss, if you're those programs, their fan base is like, this is our chance to finally compete. We finally have the rabbit out of the hat that we can compete with schools that are more prestigious than us. So we got to go all in. Programs like USC and Alabama don't have that thought process. The next one I got for you, I think Lincoln Riley and the program underestimated the negative impacts of the transfer portal, which then leads into this whole culture conversation that everyone brings up. Every program talks about culture. It is so hard to define. It's very buzz termy, but there's a lot of truth to it. There's a reason head coaches bring up culture, because it is the backbone of your program. But here's what I mean. And I don't see or hear a lot of USC folks talk about this point. So naturally, it's something that I've even leaned into more. But I remember the days of when Lincoln Riley got the job, he was getting praised for how aggressive and how quickly he was turning over the roster. And I remember being on radio shows where it was like, hey man, look at him. He's embracing the new times and he's flipping this roster and he's bringing in all these guys. When you look at the stats, 2022 had the second best transfer portal class in the country. 2023, the third best transfer portal class in the country. But I think what happened, especially when you had all the success of Caleb Williams, especially when these guys are one-year rentals, especially when, again, you're in Los Angeles, which is not insignificant. If this was in a remote college town where there's not the distractions and the distractions to take away from buying into the collective and the distractions to go off and do your own thing and not necessarily hang out with teammates on the weekends. And, you know, if you're in a remote college town, and I know this is kind of a nuanced point, but if you're in a remote college town during the summer, everyone's away and you're in summer school, you naturally hang out with everyone. When you're in Los Angeles and you just got into school in January and you went straight into spring ball and it's summertime and now I'm going to go out and explore LA and I'm living the dream out here. It's just hard to establish that culture. And what happened, because you had so much success year one, so much success, I think the players started reading the press clippings and thinking, hey, my shit doesn't stink. And as a result, this foundation lacked a sense of grit because it was established by such aggressive transfer portal moves in one-year rentals that then when that's the culture that's established, and oh, by the way, tons of success year one, Heisman Trophy winner, the whole deal, you kind of have proof of concepts to convince yourself, oh man, this is working. This is working. But before you know it, it's the end of year two, you you did not optimize a Caleb Williams run. You did not have a good defense at all. You're not gritty. And then you're trying to kind of reinvent your culture or reestablish your culture in year three. It's just really hard to do that. The first 6 months when you get hired as a college head coach, as a dude who played for 5 head coaches, those first 6 months are just as important as the next 16, the next 18. I mean, obviously you got to win games and that dictates things, but it's so critical of what you let slide, what you establish, who you bring in, who your leaders are. I think that's a big reason why my era struggled, because the Pete Carroll era was recruiting 5 stars to come in and sit behind other 5 stars. And you kind of weed out that ego. You kind of weed out some of that entitlement. And so you're stacking 5 stars on top of 5 stars. And obviously, you know, some 5 stars played right away. Reggie Bush, Mike Williams, a lot of those guys. But other guys had to wait, had to earn their stripes and look at other 5 stars who were recruited the same way they were, and they got after it in the weight room, that grimy old Heritage Hall weight room. Versus my era, unfortunately, the reality is, and I love my teammates and a bunch of good dudes, but when so many young guys were called upon early to be impact players, that set a expectation for the next young player who's coming in that like, oh, you know what? So-and-so played right away, so I'm going to play right away. And man, I don't really need to work. I don't really need to grind like that. And not that they were slappies. I'm making it out to be that they're, you know, little slappies over there, but they just weren't the OG, just dog level. And I think that in addition to the sanctions and depth, of course, for us, that's why we had to call upon young guys, the sanctions and the lack of depth. But I remember early on, I think that was a mistake that Clay Helton made, or at least something that was forced in his hand, is he inherited a terrible situation after the whole Sark situation. And he had every player could come to me, and I was kind of the welcoming force amongst all this chaos. And that was great early on. And Clay Helton's a good man. But then I think think after year 1 and year 2 when Darnold graduated and Helton was like, man, I need to establish a more gritty culture. I need to start getting on kids' asses. At that point, kids like, wait, that's not the Helton that I know. That's not the culture that I inherited. Wait, what's going on with this guy? And his message kind of falls on deaf ears, hence the importance of those first 6 months. So early on, back to the core point here, Lincoln Riley got a ton of praise for how quickly he turned the roster over. And in that first year, it resulted in a ton of success. And obviously Caleb Williams Heisman was great, but I think the underneath foundation of that was not the most healthy culture to build a program on. And in hindsight, I wouldn't be surprised when Lincoln Riley comes out with his book. I wouldn't be surprised if he wishes they hadn't won as many games year 1 because you don't buy into that my shit doesn't stink narrative. You maybe level up the grittiness and the culture they were trying to establish into year 2 and year 3 rather than trying to have to restart things. Next point I got for you guys, it's a pet peeve of mine. I might get flack for this. I don't know, but comparing everything, whether verbally or subconsciously, to the Pete Carroll era is just out of touch. Dude, Pete Carroll was the coach 15 years ago in a different generation of kid, night and day, different generation of kid. I've referenced it before with the whole social media and all that. I think it's a real factor. You know, before the prospects of, hey, I could go play college football and I could be around Will Ferrell and Snoop Dogg as a college athlete. That's crazy. Versus now with the smartphones, you know, if you're that kind of guy, I don't care if you're playing for USC or Clemson or Virginia Tech or Penn State, like you can be that Mr. Cool guy and have that flash and have that exposure. It was cutting edge when Pete Carroll was there. I don't think that factor is as cutting edge. And I've referenced the downside of some of that flash for USC, that if I was the head coach this offseason, if I was trying to self-correct, if I'm Lincoln Riley, I would overemphasize going the other way. How can I have the hardest winter conditioning of any program in the country? Because I know the type of kid that's going to USC, especially if he's not from Southern California, is probably getting enamored with the bright lights of Southern California. I've always thought this. The type of recruit, and there's outliers here, don't get me wrong. Leonard Williams was the best college football player I ever played with, and he's from Florida. But the type of kid who's a big-time recruit in the state of Florida that travels all across the country and past other blue blood programs to go to USC, I would argue, if you just averaged it out, that kid is not as gritty as the kid that maybe is coming from the Midwest or just closer to home. Because why are you coming out to USC? Why are you passing up Florida, Alabama, Tennessee, Texas, Oklahoma to come to USC? Don't get me wrong. I was an out-of-state guy. There's a lot to love about USC, but I've always, a red flag's gone up in my mind when that happens, because are you just coming for the beaches and the girls and the more friendly substance guidelines on the West Coast that we have? I think it's a fair criticism. That's a little bit contradictory of the whole national outlook of the generation of the teenagers that I mentioned before, but I think it's a point worth considering. I mentioned the different generation of kid that Pete Carroll had to deal with. The most important one, though, is NIL. NIL has changed the game. Pete Carroll did not have to deal with NIL. And if he did back then, I bet USC boosters and the support there financially probably was in a different space, to be honest. I think the national championships that Pete Carroll brought USC have just a tad of complacency, not complacency, but just if you're a big time booster that has more money than you know what to do with, I think in the back of your mind, you're like, you know what, Pete got it done. I'm not going to cough up that much money. Versus if you're a booster at Oregon, A&M, Ole Miss, you're like, dude, I've been waiting. I've been craving. This is our opportunity for a national championship. But I got to that point. In the portal, though, this is where it comes through. You lose Zachariah Branch, you lose Kyron Hudson, you lose Deuce Robinson, Emmanuel Pregnon, Mason Murphy. I don't follow the message boards. I'm not deep into the recruiting side of things. I don't know the NIL specifics. This is my full-time job, so I have a general frame of reference, but I don't know specific nuances with these guys. But I would have to imagine if USC was in a better standing NIL-wise, those guys don't leave, or at least most of those guys stay. Because, again, I follow college football nationally. I know how fired up Penn State fans are to get Kyron Hudson. The reality is USC fans were like, yeah, I love him. He had that sick one-handed catch against LSU in Vegas, but, you know, we can get the next receiver. We're USC. We're receiver U. We can get the next guy. Deuce Robinson sitting there saying, what, I was receiver 4 for USC last year? Receiver 3, maybe? Florida State is fired up to get him. Florida State's like, yo, we're going to feed him the rock every single time. Versus USC's like, we can probably get the next guy. Don't get me wrong. Those guys are studs. We're going to miss him. But I think Lincoln Riley had to make a business decision, and I think he deserves credit for this. The delta between a Deuce Robinson, Kyron Hudson, and Zachariah Branch and the really good or whatever, above above average receiver in the portal is not as big of a delta compared to front seven player and, above average front seven player in the portal. So let me allocate my resources to the front seven players. And I wouldn't be surprised if that's a dynamic. And I also wouldn't be surprised if those receivers said, USC, you're giving me 250 grand. I don't know what it is. I know Penn State's willing to give me 600 grand. Sorry, coach. I might not make it to the league. I got to go get paid. I think that's the realities of what it was. I will say the Emmanuel Pregnon one, that hurt my heart because I would imagine there's some of the Oregon blank check, and I'm sure the comments let me know what I'm missing. When I first saw that, and when I first saw the receivers transfer, I was like, that sucks, but okay, invest that money into an Emmanuel Pregnon or a Mason Murphy and secure the offensive line. We can go get receivers in the portal. And when those guys left, I was like, dang, what are we missing there? And if Oregon comes over the top with a blank check, that's just something that's out of Lincoln Riley's hands and something that Pete Carroll didn't have to deal with. And unfortunately, to wake up the donor base for USC, there might need to be a couple more years of struggling to get to a point where it's like, enough is enough. This is ridiculous. We got to invest, because I'm sitting there and I'm seeing Sark at Texas competing for national championships and Lane Kiffin at Ole Miss competing for SEC championships. And then under this scenario, Lincoln Riley at blank doing whatever he's doing. This pod is way longer than I thought. Once you get me going, I should have known this was going to happen. But I want to run down some stats to finish this one off, and let me know what's jumping out to you in the comments. Would love to do a follow-up video on this. I referenced it earlier. The perception around USC, I think, would be a lot different with the close losses that happened last year. There are 6 FBS teams that led in every fourth quarter this season. USC is one of them. USC has 5 losses. The other 5 teams have 5 losses combined. On one side, you can say that's poor coaching, and there's a lot of criticism there. I think Lincoln Riley has this thing with the run game in the fourth quarter that he could be better in. I would imagine, having a general vibe of his temperament, that he is diving deep into that. Here's a better way to put it. I would be willing to bet this spring ball 4-minute offense, which is when the defense knows you have to run and offensively you still need to run the rock. I would imagine a 4-minute offense is getting hammered into these players' brains all the time because it's a critical weakness for USC. But I say this stat because I don't think Lincoln Riley is a bad football coach. Last season was an outlier. I don't expect this to happen again. That was ridiculous. And I do think with college kids, that is the type of factor that can create a negative snowball effect where we've done it once, we've done it twice. Oh crap, the fourth quarter's coming. Here we go again. Dun, 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 dun. And that happens. Other stats that I want to reference, the blue chip ratio of USC rosters in recent memory. This was fascinating to me. USC's 2024 roster had a 59% blue chip ratio of the players on their team. That was 14th nationally. So to say differently, USC had the 14th best roster on paper nationally. I'm sure you can debate that, but my first reaction is that's crazy. Imagine saying that 10 years ago. USC always had 4th, 5th, 3rd, 6th best roster nationally. But then dating back, so it's 59% in 2024. Let's go back a decade ago or 11 years ago. 2014, that was 64%. And I'll put these graphics on the side. 2015, 70%. 16, 70%. 17, 63. 18, 71. 19, 60. 50, 53, 52. Point being, there's been a steady decline really ever since on the back end of Helton, and then it wasn't able to pick up with Lincoln Riley. I think Helton struggled to recruit, struggled to win. That number makes sense to me. But then you're seeing the impacts of Lincoln's, his struggles recruiting wise, which is funny. That's why I just stuttered right there, because right now USC is the #1 recruiting class in the country, I believe. So maybe this is getting corrected, but contextually, that's an interesting stat to see there. Other ones, and again, I'll put the stats next to me right here. I mentioned the recruiting and transfer rankings. Kind of crazy to look back on. 2022, the 2nd best transfer portal class. 2023, the 3rd best transfer portal class. On paper, that's amazing. I think just reading between the lines, and I've heard interviews of Lincoln being like, man, maybe we should have been more selective and whatnot. They definitely should have been more selective. I think they missed on some of those guys, and I don't know specific names, but I think in hindsight, they probably would have taken the B player instead of the A player if that B player had the better grit, work ethic, and able to establish that foundation. 2024, nothing really sticks out there. But then 2025, right now, the 66th best transfer class in the country. That is concerning. The spring window after spring ball ball will be a huge deal. Scoring offense, I mentioned this earlier, 2023, man, what a missed opportunity that was. You put Danton Lynn defense on that 2023 roster, ooh, what could have been. Third best offense in the country, like literally the worst defense in the country. And then last year, offense took a huge drop. One of the worst offensive years in Lincoln Riley's career. The 51st best offense in the country. And I referenced this earlier. I think Lincoln Riley is a incredibly creative mind, but to me, it's almost like the 2015 Golden State Warriors. And I say 15 because it's before everyone started embracing three-pointers. But here's the comp that I'll give you. It reminds me of when you played those the Warrior teams. Maybe it's 14 before they actually started winning titles. But when you play those Warriors teams, when they're hitting threes, it's like, dude, everyone should do this. This is the best thing ever. Oh, this is great. But then there also comes a point where if you're cold on one night and you start missing threes, you look ridiculous because it's like, go inside the paint, stop chucking up threes all the time. That's how Lincoln Riley's offense sometimes looks. It's like you're always trying to go for the creative wheel route or the creative unique play call or the downfield shot kind of thing. But sometimes maybe we just hit an arrow route into the flat, stick with the run game and do that. And I think reassessing how he navigates his play calling is a big deal this upcoming year. Ooh, this is the last point I wanted to get to. This is fascinating to me. When you look at the top D-line recruits from California each year in recent memory, let's see where they went. Actually, let's not see where they went. You know where they went. The Texas, Oregon, Ohio State, Georgia, all that kind of deal. But 2025, the top 3 D-line recruits, Sharma, 4-star recruit. Johnson, 4-star recruit. Jamal Hane, 3-star recruit. No 5-star recruits. 2024, same thing. No 5-star recruits. 2023, 2 3-star recruits make that top list. That's crazy. No 5-star recruits. 2022, no 5-star recruits. That is why if you're a head coach sitting in that saddle, you feel the need to go outside of the West Coast to build that recruiting base. The counter to that is, Max, go find the hidden gems. Mason Graham is sitting right there, class of 2022. You can't miss on him. That's a fair criticism. That's where you need to get better from an evaluation standpoint. Same thing with top inside offensive linemen here. You look at the past 4 years, there's not a single 5-star interior offensive lineman in the state of California, and I'm seeing a lot of 3-star talent in there. And when I was diving in and just looking at some of the stats for this, and maybe this is a separate video, let me know if you want to see it, but there is some Twitter chatter or some X chatter about how Southern California recruiting, or LA specifically, is not as strong, and there's like analytic guys that have dove into that. It's not as strong as we make it out to be. Don't hear that as me making excuses for Lincoln Riley. I'm just saying facts about the West Coast and the state of California that, to me, it's a pet peeve when people criticize the recruiting strategy, because I've literally lived through both sides of it. The Kiffin's crazy. Why is he going national? Helton can't recruit. Why is he only going local? He can't find the big time playmakers. We need playmakers like Georgia and Alabama, and you can't win. You can't have it both ways. All right, that one got long. I went all over the place with that video. That was fun though. That was more of a state of the union. I know I didn't get into how I would improve things, some of the nuances of the play calling, some of the nuances of recruiting. It was more of from a 10,000 foot view. So let me know if you guys want a follow-up video on this. And if you like this, hit the like button down below. Subscribe as well. It means a lot. And I'll see you on the next one. Thanks, guys. Wait. Shouldn't have said thanks, guys. That's what I usually say. Fight on.